Welcome to the Barakat Trust podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast of the Barakat Trust. My name is Thomas, and I am the communications coordinator here. And today I'm delighted to welcome Umberto Bongianino to talk to us about calligraphy in Morocco. Welcome, Umberto.
Thank you very much, Thomas. It's a pleasure to be here.
Umberto is a Samir Shamma Associate Professor in Numismatics, Epigraphy and Material Culture at the Khalili Research Centre, which is the Centre for the Study and Teaching of Islamic Art at the University of Oxford. And today we're here to talk about a specific part of his research and interests, which are vast, ranging from Arabic epigraphy, the aesthetic of inscribed objects, and arts of the book. But today we'll be focusing specifically on epigraphy and Umberto's participation in a project that has taken place over the past few years called CalFront. CalFront is a project led by the University of the Sorbonne in Paris, which has been aiming over the past few years to look at the calligraphic traditions of the so-called frontiers of the Islamic world, fitting in very well with the theme of this year's podcast series, Peripheries. And so this means the project looking not just at the central lands or the Arab lands that are traditionally seen as the heart of Arabic calligraphy, Egypt, the Hejaz, Levant, Mesopotamia, but having a wider lens, including China, India, Southeast Asia, the Balkans. And Umberto's role in this has been on Il Maghrib, the western section of the Islamic world, today forming Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and southern Spain. And incidentally, I should also say that the Barakat Trust gave a small grant back in 2020 when the project was in its infancy for a series of workshops, I believe in Paris, around the time the project was getting on its feet. And so it's nice to be here 5 years later as the project is wrapping up and to hear from Umberto how your role, your section of this project has come together.
Yes, of course. So I thought I would just introduce myself and my research by contextualizing a bit Maghribi scripts and calligraphy within the development of calligraphy in Arabic scripts. One of the things that I always tell my students is that there isn't one Arabic script, just as there isn't one Islamic architecture or one style of manuscript painting. Arabic writing evolved into a wide variety of regional traditions, each reflecting different artistic ideals, different political contexts, and different communities of readers and patrons. So when most people think of Islamic calligraphy, they probably tend to imagine the elegant scripts that developed in places like Baghdad or Cairo or Istanbul. So the so-called six styles that became particularly influential in the Eastern Islamic world, Nasr, Thuluth, Muhaqqaq, etc. Those scripts are rightly celebrated. They became enormously prestigious during the Mamluk and Ottoman period, but they are only part of the story. If we travel to the Western Islamic world, that is to Al-Andalus, which is present-day Spain and Portugal under Muslim rule, and to present-day countries like Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, we encounter a completely different calligraphic tradition, known today as Maghribi, or as I call them, Maghribī Round Scripts. At first glance, Maghribi looks very different from the scripts people may already know. It is rounder, but it also has surprisingly angular features. It is often more fluid and more expansive than the Arabic calligraphy of the Islamic East. Some letters stretch dramatically across the page, others do graceful loops. It has a rhythm and movement that is immediately recognizable once you've learned to see it. But these visual differences are not simply decorative. They reflect a different aesthetic language, a language that developed over many centuries alongside with its own manuscript culture and intellectual traditions. As I argue in my book, The Manuscript Tradition of the Islamic West, Maghribi Script was not a deviation from some universal norm. It was the outcome of a long, coherent historical development rooted in the Islamic West itself. And what I also find particularly interesting is that the script also became a marker of identity. So a manuscript copied in Cordoba, in Marrakesh, or in Tunis could often be recognized immediately by its handwriting in the Islamic East. In other words, calligraphy was saying something about where a book or where an inscribed artifact came from and the cultural world to which it belonged. We often think of identity being expressed through language, architecture, clothing, but handwriting can be just as powerful. It can carry this sense of place. And now, historically, Maghribi script occupied a rather curious position. Within the Islamic West, it was admired, cultivated, transmitted for generations. It was the script in which Qurans were copied, legal texts were studied, poetry was written, royal manuscripts were produced. But outside the region, especially in modern scholarship, it received much less attention than the Eastern traditions. And part of that is simply because the history of Islamic calligraphy has long been written from the perspective of the great Eastern capitals of the central Islamic lands. If you begin your story in Baghdad and end it in Istanbul, then Morocco naturally appears to sit at the edge of the map. But if you begin with the manuscripts themselves, the picture changes completely. You realize that the Islamic world was never organized around a single artistic center, radiating influence outwards. It was a network of interconnected regions, each developing its own visual language while remaining in dialogue with the others. And that has become the central theme of my research and the focus of my contribution for the Cold Front project. And if I may, there is another point that I think is important to make, especially for a general audience. We often describe calligraphy as if it were simply beautiful handwriting. And of course, it is beautiful. But in the medieval Islamic world, it was much more than that. And up until the modern period, because remember that in the Islamic world, calligraphy is an art that lasted well into the 20th century and it's still practiced today. Writing was considered one of the highest artistic achievements because it transmitted the Quran, it preserved knowledge, and it gave visible form to language itself. A beautiful copied manuscript wasn't simply pleasing to the eye, it embodied prestige, learning, devotion, and craftsmanship all at once. And that is why I find Maghribi manuscripts so compelling, even if they differ from their Eastern counterparts. And when you hold them in your hands, you're not just looking at ink on paper, you're looking at the results of countless artistic decisions, the way that pen was cut, the spacing between the lines, the proportions of each letter, the dialogue between the script and the illumination. Every page reflects an artistic culture that is specific to the context in which the manuscript was produced. So when we ask where manuscripts from the Maghrib fit into the broader history of Islamic art, my answer is that the Maghrib doesn't sit at the margins of that history. The Maghribi tradition is one of the great regional traditions, distinctive, sophisticated, remarkably creative, and perhaps one of the most exciting developments today is that scholars are beginning to appreciate it not just as an exception or a footnote to the history of Islamic calligraphy, but also as an essential part of that history, thanks to projects like Cold Front.
So clearly with this increasing interest, but also appreciation for the Maghribi style, there's one thing I want to ask you about that you mentioned briefly, which is the way that the column, the pen, the stylus is cut. Obviously, there's many different visual comparisons we can make between in the Maghribi style and the other Mashriqi styles. But I just wondered if you could focus and tell us a little bit more about how the way the pen is cut influences the visual formations that appear in the calligraphy.
Yes, of course. As you said, the Maghribi column is cut in a very different way from the Eastern tradition. It is also made of a different kind of reed, which is larger than the reeds used in the East, and it's a reed that it's cut halfway through its length, so the calligrapher holds half a reed in their hand, not a whole reed. And the nib is rather pointy, so it is trimmed to a sort of blunt point. It's not beveled, which means that shading is not really possible. I mean, the difference between thick and thin strokes. In Maghribi Script, that difference is highlighted by a different pressure applied to the column as opposed to the angle at which the nib is pressed against the paper or parchment. So Maghribi calligraphers have historically used a different kind of column trimmed in a very distinctive way with this pointy nib that gives the handwriting a very uniform aspect, except for certain serifs or tails where the calligrapher pushes the pen or lifts the pen so that the script becomes bolder or faints. And of course, the way that the column is cut has influenced the calligraphy, and the result is that the aesthetic of this script is profoundly different from what is deemed beautiful or pleasant to the eye according to the Eastern tradition.
This brings me nicely onto our next point, which is the idea of beauty and what is considered as beauty, and who has the authority to deem one style as more beautiful than the other. Why does this relegation of the Maghribi script, the Maghribi style, in comparison to the Eastern style, where does it arise from and why? Is this a very, you mentioned earlier modern scholarship, but does it also have older roots, maybe before the 20th century, before there were profound changes in the calligraphic tradition around the entire Islamic world?
Yes, that's a good question. Obviously, misconceptions don't appear out of nowhere, so there is a history to this narrative. But I would say, if you look at medieval sources, people in different parts of the Islamic world were certainly aware that there were different regional scripts. And you find evidence of scholars from Cairo or Baghdad recognizing Maghribi writing as something distinct and sometimes even as something beautiful. We have, for instance, the testimony of a Mamluk author talking about a lavish Quran that was sent by the Sultan of Morocco to Egypt in the late 13th century, I think. And he describes it as a beautiful Quran, lavishly calligraphed and illuminated. So obviously, there were people in the East who were able to appreciate calligraphic skill, even if it came from a different part of the Islamic world. I think the real problem begins later, particularly from the 19th century onwards, when modern histories of Arabic calligraphy started to be written. And these histories were often based on the Ottoman tradition, which had developed a very sophisticated system of teaching, certification, and transmission. So you had famous master calligraphers, formal apprenticeships, manuals, albums of exemplary writing, and well-documented genealogies showing what pupil had studied with what teacher.
Yeah.
And when scholars looked for the same institutional framework in Morocco or even in medieval Al-Andalus, they didn't find it, or at least they didn't find it in the same form.
Yeah.
And from that absence, they drew a rather unfortunate conclusion. They assumed that because the institutions looked different, the artistic tradition itself must have been less developed. And you find statements in 20th century scholarship, both in Arabic and in European languages, claiming that Maghribi calligraphy lacked clear rules, or that every calligrapher in the Maghreb simply wrote according to personal taste. And some authors even described it as a spontaneous or almost accidental type of calligraphy. Those ideas became very influential, were repeated from one publication to another, and today even respected manuals on Arabic calligraphy continue to characterize Maghribi writing as lacking standards or fixed principles well into recent decades. And well, as historians, we all carry invisible assumptions. So if we decide in advance that a sophisticated calligraphy tradition should look like this, then we tend to privilege traditions that fit our expectations.
Yeah.
But if another, if we look at different traditions and with an unbiased eye, we may find a lot of thought and a lot of artistry in them.
This idea, we can call it at this point a misconception that arose, you're saying, from the 19th century and really took root in the 20th century. You clearly have a different take, a different view on how we should be thinking about the Maghribi style. How do you support your view or this changing view of Maghribi calligraphy? What's the evidence to show that it is in fact just as worthy as other traditions that have been held in higher esteem for longer?
Yes, it is a fair assumption. Obviously, beauty is subjective, and a calligrapher trained in the Ottoman tradition will, of course, tend to believe that that tradition is the most beautiful and the most developed and refined. The same way a Maghribi calligrapher might think differently. I think as historians we have to ground our arguments in material evidence, so we can look at the manuscripts themselves, what they tell us, and we can also look at the sources. Works by Moroccan scholars written about aesthetics, calligraphy, this kind of evidence. So the manuscripts themselves, if you look closely at them, as I've been doing for some years now, you start noticing an extraordinary consistency that proves that this tradition was not haphazard, it was not unregulated. Letter forms evolve gradually over centuries. Sometimes they intentionally hark back to earlier forms. Proportions are maintained, but also tweaked and developed in certain directions. Particular ways of arranging the page became characteristic of different periods. Decorative innovations appear, spread, and were refined over the centuries. None of that happens by accident. That reflects a living artistic tradition with its own internal coherence. And then we have sources. One of the most important discoveries of recent years has been the recovery of Moroccan texts that actually explain how calligraphers themselves understood their art.
Okay.
And a wonderful example is the early 19th century intellectual and calligrapher Ahmed Rifai Ribati from Rabat. He wrote a didactic poem and an extensive treatise in prose on calligraphy, which I'm currently studying with Nuria Garcia Masip, a scholar and calligrapher based at the Sorbonne in Paris. And this work immediately overturns one of the oldest stereotypes. Here is a Moroccan calligrapher discussing geometry, proportion, aesthetics, even the spiritual significance of letters in remarkable detail, according to his own tradition. He describes learning from his teachers, analyzing the structure of individual letters, reflecting on what makes beautiful writing beautiful. So this is clearly not someone practicing an unregulated craft. It's someone thinking deeply about a highly sophisticated artistic discipline. And one passage I find especially moving is where the author remembers his childhood, and he describes becoming smitten with letters, as he puts it. He even says, inebriated with the wine of joy, when he describes his love for calligraphy. So he talks about watching his teacher writing on wooden Quranic tablets. He copied every stroke and then compared learning calligraphy to picking flowers from his master's garden. It's a poetic description of artistic apprenticeship, of course, and it reminds us that for him, calligraphy wasn't just technique, it was also emotion, devotion, and intellectual curiosity. And more broadly, I think this is an important reminder that we shouldn't confuse absence of evidence with evidence of absence. The fact that fewer Moroccan sources survive, and the fact that those that survive have remained overlooked for a long time, it doesn't mean that they never existed. It means that we hadn't been asking the right questions. And so with the Cold Front project, which, as you mentioned, is based at the Sorbonne, directed by Héloïse Barguet-Perrière and Maxime Durocher, we try to explore artistic traditions that have often been treated as peripheral within the Islamic world, ask what happens when we begin with the local evidence rather than with inherited narratives. And if we look closely and hard enough, we do find evidence of very elaborate calligraphic traditions, both from the point of view of practice and from the point of view of theoretical elaboration.
Yeah, and I mean, the poem, you mentioned the wine of joy and picking flowers. I mean, these are some of the highest metaphors that can be used to describe anything in pre-modern Islamic poetry. So yeah, that really does support your point. So you mentioned two sources really, both of them historical, the theoretical works, the treatises, the poems that theorize this sense of a tradition, and then the material evidence itself, whether that's the manuscripts or other examples of the calligraphy. I wonder, I'm aware that as part of the project, you had the opportunity to spend some time with calligraphers today who continue to practice the tradition. I wonder how that informed you, if we reduce the experience to a source for studying calligraphy. What did you learn from spending time with a calligrapher who continues this tradition and passing it on and continues to produce?
You learn a great deal, yes. In 2024, I spent a week in Fez with some members of the Cold Front team, interviewing one of Morocco's foremost contemporary calligraphers, Hamidi Belaid. And we try to understand not just how Maghribi calligraphy is practiced today, but also how it's learned, experienced, and transmitted. And one of the things that fascinated me most was that Hamidi Belaid had never read the 19th century treatise by Rifai that I
Oh,
have
really?
been studying, that I mentioned. He had no direct knowledge of this text. And yet, as he described his own training, I realized that he had followed almost exactly the same path as Rifai
Wow.
described nearly 2 centuries earlier. Like generations of Moroccan children before him, Hamid ibn Aid began in the Kutab, the traditional Quranic school, learning to write on wooden tablets. And then, when he was an adolescent, he immersed himself in beautiful Maghribi manuscripts, copying them patiently, trying to absorb their rhythm and the proportion of the letters by imitation. And that is something that Arifai writes very explicitly in his own treatise. And he remembers watching his teacher write, gradually training his eye before he ever began thinking consciously about geometry or theory. So reading that text and then hearing Hamid ibn Aid describe almost the same educational journey was, one of those extraordinary moments when history suddenly feels close. And it also reminded me that Arabic calligraphy, yes, it's transmitted through written manuals, but also, and perhaps especially through practice, observation, and the eye, and the imitation of the work of the masters. So you learn by looking, by repeating, by developing a sensitivity to proportion, almost before you can explain it in words. And then theoretical and intellectual frameworks come at a later stage.
Yeah.
And there was also another moment during my time in Fes that I remember fondly. And we were in the Karawin library with Hamid ibn Aid, looking at one medieval Quran copied, 700 years ago by a master calligrapher. So Hamidi stood in front of the manuscript for a very long time, looking very closely at the calligraphy. And he wasn't simply admiring the calligraphy for its beauty. He was really feeling a very strong emotion in recognizing the person behind the calligraphy. And he put it in words. He could see immediately the confidence of the column, the discipline, the countless hours of practice that lay behind every letter in that particular manuscript. So he wasn't looking just at an object, he was recognizing a fellow craftsman. And there was this moment of communion between the modern calligrapher and the medieval one, through essentially that is only possible because the modern calligrapher understands the aesthetic principles and all the various elements that are part of the calligraphy that make it beautiful and extraordinary. This was a particularly beautiful Quran, but because this tradition has had this coherent development, it is still possible for modern calligraphers to understand earlier examples in very much the same way.
I suppose also it's one of those relatively rare moments in Islamic art where you can interact and learn from somebody who continues the tradition rather than, for example, I don't know, if we're going to study coins, these were produced and there is now a clean break and coins no longer produced in the same way whatsoever. There is very little that one can learn from coins today to study the coins of the past. And so that also, I imagine, is a very special moment to see how a tradition continues to live and grow, well, I suppose, under
indeed.
pressure from the printing press and other digital tools.
Yes, he has pupils, so I'm sure the tradition will continue. Yes.
Fantastic. So I now just want to take a slight step out, a zoom out. We've talked about the Maghribi script in some detail. And I want to sort of link it back in with the idea of peripheries or frontiers, as the project calls them, which obviously is based on the idea that there is a center, as we've mentioned so far, the traditional or the traditionally the city is traditionally seen as the center of the production of calligraphy or a style or conventions. I suppose it's also we have to be careful not to assume that the Maghribi style developed or evolved in isolation. That you've mentioned the exchange and the linkage across North Africa into Al-Andalus. What can the calligraphy, the style, the tradition reveal about this idea of exchange between Maghrib, the Western Islamic world, and other parts? And maybe that isn't necessarily heading directly east to the Eastern Mediterranean, but also looking south into the Sahel, West Africa, and other directions.
Yes. So one thing that I usually say is that, in a way, the Maghribi tradition is richer than the Mashriqi one, because Maghribis were forced to interact with the Eastern tradition. We have, for instance, Maghribi calligraphers in the Middle Ages, but also in modern times, that pride themselves in being able to write both Maghribi and Mashriqi scripts.
Okay.
We have Maghribi reinterpretations of Mashriqi scripts, especially in epigraphy. So in a way, the Maghribi tradition was very much connected with the rest of the Islamic world. You mentioned Sub-Saharan Africa, of course. Many of the scripts developed in West Africa and in Sub-Saharan Africa are linked with the Maghribi tradition. Historically, that makes a lot of sense, of course, even if that is a different kind of evidence that we have, because the earliest manuscripts from Timbuktu and other places in that region date from the 16th century. So we are in a situation where we cannot really see evidence of the earlier development of these regional scripts. Whereas in Cairo, Baghdad, or Istanbul, calligraphers did not engage with Maghribi script. They had no need to do so. Few of them traveled. In fact, I don't know of any Eastern calligrapher who traveled to the Maghrib in order to learn Maghribi script in historic times. So that gives us an interesting edge, if you like. And obviously, the Islamic world was never divided into a center and then a series of peripheries to the west, but also to the east. The manuscripts tell a very different story. So today, if you visit the Dar al-Kutub in Cairo, the Suleymaniye in Istanbul, or other libraries in the Middle East, you will find beautiful manuscripts copied in Morocco or Al-Andalus. And conversely, if you look at medieval and early modern libraries in Morocco, you find books that traveled from Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and beyond. So books were mobile objects. Scholars, pilgrims, merchants, diplomats were moving constantly across the Islamic world, carrying manuscripts with them. And perhaps the Hajj is absolutely central to that network. And obviously Moroccans go on Hajj. They have been going on Hajj since medieval times. And on the way, they stop in cities like Cairo, Damascus, Mecca, Medina, of course, where they sometimes settle for years, studying with local scholars, producing manuscripts. So this is how these regional calligraphic schools and manuscript traditions intermingle and cross-pollinate with each other, thanks to the mobility of people and the mobility of of manuscripts. And I think this is where the idea of frontiers or borders, if you like, becomes especially helpful. In modern languages, a frontier often sounds like a boundary separating two worlds, but historically, frontiers were often the opposite. They're places where people meet, where ideas circulate. There are spaces for connection. And that's very much the philosophy behind the Cold Front project, which, as you said, brings together scholars working on regions that have often been described as peripheral. So from Morocco to Ethiopia, Central Asia, India, Southeast Asia, China even. So what unites these different case studies is the conviction that if we begin with the evidence produced in these regions themselves, rather than measuring them against a presumed center, we discover remarkably dynamic artistic cultures that were fully engaged with the wider Islamic world.
Wow, thank you, because that's definitely put into perspective how your specific case study fits in with everything else. Before we finish, I wanted to ask or take a more personal direction. And clearly you've perused many examples of Maghribi script in manuscripts and in epigraphy. I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to share with us a personal favorite that you've come across over the past few years that you feel like really exemplifies the ideas we've discussed today, whether that's visually or socially or more generally on a historical level, whether that's movement or so on.
Yes. So that's of course a difficult question because I've become attached to quite a few manuscripts that are very special in a way because of the stories they tell. But one in particular, I think, is a Maghribi Quran, which is now preserved in the Dar al-Kutub, so the National Library of Egypt in Cairo. And what makes this Quran so special is not just its beauty, although of course it is really one of the finest examples of 18th century Moroccan calligraphy and illumination, but also the story that it tells. So the Quran was copied in 1768, presumably in Fez, for an Alawite prince, so the son of Sultan Muhammad III, the son of the ruling Sultan of Morocco. At that time, he was governor of Fez, so I think it is plausible that the manuscript was also copied in Fez. So it's a lavishly illuminated manuscript written in very elegant Maghribi script, clearly produced at the highest level of the Moroccan court. But here is where the story becomes intriguing. In that very same year, 1768, Prince Ali left Morocco to perform the Hajj. And we were just talking about the Hajj. We don't know what happened next. So this is one of those moments where historians have to be comfortable with uncertainty. Did Prince Ali take this Quran with him on pilgrimage? Was it intended as a personal companion on that journey? Was it perhaps meant as a diplomatic gift? We simply don't know. But we do know that by 1774, which is only 6 years later, the manuscript was in Egypt. And there in Cairo, it was endowed by Muhammad Bey Abu Dhahab, the powerful Mamluk emir and Ottoman regent of Egypt. It was endowed by him to the great mosque madrasa that he had founded in Cairo. And thanks to that endowment, the manuscript eventually entered the Dar al-Kutub, where it has remained ever since. So for me, the most revealing detail isn't just that the manuscript traveled from Morocco to Egypt. Books traveled all the time. It's the wording of Abu Dhahab's endowment deed, which has survived It was actually published in 1979 by Daniel Christelius. So Abu Dhahab doesn't just list the manuscripts that he endows to his madrasa. He doesn't just mention this Quran among many others. He explicitly identifies it as a Maghribi Quran and singles it out as the most important Quran in his endowed library. So this is revealing. So today we hear that Maghribi calligraphy was considered inferior or provincial. But here we have one of the most powerful patrons in 18th century Egypt deliberately drawing attention to the manuscript's Western origin. And that suggests that he considered it something distinctive, valuable, and that this Quran wasn't just appreciated despite its Maghribi calligraphy, perhaps it was appreciated because of it. And this reminds us that if a manuscript is beautiful, is made with a lot of care and, of course, precious materials and a lot of skill, that translates across calligraphic traditions.
Sure. Well, I imagine that this manuscript in the madrasa in Cairo inspired many of the students who had the fortune to study in the same building where it was kept for decades until it was moved to the Qutb.
Yes, yeah.
And I'm sure that many of our listeners will also be inspired by what we've been talking about today. So I want to thank you, Umberto, for your insights, for sharing your knowledge, your research, your passion, most importantly, for the Maghribi script. And it's been a pleasure to have you,
on the
podcast.
Thank you for giving me this space.
Thank you for listening to the Barakat Trust podcast.